We actually had a few letters over the last few years complaining at the sheer number of articles we've run on the links between intelligence community and powder drug traffic. And it's one of the few subjects in Nexus that we've actually had pressure on us not to publish right from the word go. Specifically the links with British intelligence to the drug trade. They don't care about the CIA being into the drug trade because everyone knows. So the reason we persevered, we're publishing articles linking the intelligence community to the drug trade is because it needs to be known. It's widespread. As Mike will tell you, it's not just the CIA, it's factions of virtually every intelligence agency on the planet. I'm going to let Mike introduce himself in terms of his background and experience and how he got into all this. But this is his first trip to Australia.
Yeah.
So please give him a big, warm Sydney welcome.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you. Hi, my name is Mike. I'm an alcoholic. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm at the wrong meeting. What we're going to do today is a shortened, truncated version of a lecture which I have now given some 15 times since September the 11th throughout the United States and Canada, which has, of course, attracted a lot of attention, as we've discovered again last night. And it is basically the truth and lies of September the 11th. And what I do in this lecture, and I want to set out some clear parameters before I start. Most of you know that I'm a former LAPD narcotics investigator. You also know that I'm a professional journalist. This is my newsletter from the wilderness. We are now read in 30 countries and by 20 members of the U.S. Congress, the intelligence committees of both houses in the U.S., and professors at 12 universities in the U.S., Canada, and Great Britain. And you can find information on the website, on the newsletter at our website, which is www.copvcia.com. There's two ways to get there. Think of a court case, a cop fighting the CIA, or fromthewilderness.com, and you can go there, and we have two kinds of subscriptions. One is an online subscription, which is $35 US a year, and the other is a hard copy we actually mail, which is $50 plus a postage. It costs a little more to mail down here, but you can have it either way. A great deal of the information on the website is free, and I do that because what we need to do is to pay the bills to do the research and investigation. I have 4 writers working for me now to research the stories, to print, publish, travel, and so forth to get the information out, but we try to give as much away as possible because these are dicey times. We also have a videotape, and I was not able to bring many because I didn't want to battle with the customs officers when I came in, but we have a tape, The Truth and Lies of 9/11, which is the long version of what you're going to see today, which is also available from the website in PAL or in NTSC format, however you want it. We've sold about 4,000 of those without advertising, and I'm afraid to advertise, actually, to tell you the truth. So I'm grateful that so many of you are here. Now, I'm going to throw a lot of stuff at you, but here's what I do and here's what I don't do. My editorial philosophy has been from the start that I do not publish anything that I cannot source, that I cannot tell you, this is where I found it. If you doubt me, go check for yourself. That is one of the things that I have found is most effective, because aside from being a journalist or someone who wants to entertain, enlighten, or rock your boat, so to speak, I am also a warrior. I am in this to fight the people who do these things. I am in this to stop the people who do these things, and we believe we found a formula which helps to do that for those either brave enough, or there's an old saying that at a ham and eggs breakfast, the chicken is involved but the pig is committed. And for those of you who have decided that you have become pigs rather than chickens, what we have offered here is a way to fight that works. And I think you will see that in recent developments in the state over President Bush being backed into a corner about what he knew and didn't know, I'll tell you that From the Wilderness had a small part in bringing those confrontations to pass, and it's not over yet. There is a way to fight. There is a way to stand up. There is a way to exert God-given liberties, which we all hold dear from the covenants that were given to us by Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and the founding fathers, that there is a spark of divinity in all of us which is inalienable and cannot be taken away. and for which we are responsible for nurturing and caring for and protecting. So with that, there are things I don't talk about 9/11. I do not talk about speculative avenues. I do not go into where there are explosives in the towers, where the planes are remote controlled, because those are journalistic suicide missions. You cannot come out of them alive. You cannot prove them true or false. My tactic has been very straightforward. One, to paint a documented historical background for what happened so that you have a map, and that's where we get our logo from. It's about giving you a map, an accurate map of the world that you can read and navigate for yourselves. And also, what we do is we prove that the government has been lying, clearly, that their statements are false, and that it's because of the lies that their credibility should be challenged, and that the truth can emerge. And some of you may know that our laptop, or my laptop, was stolen out of the room last night, and I don't know how to wake this up, so I did, okay. I could slap it, but I've tried to give that up. There is an old saying from Gandhi: first they ignore you, then they mock you, then they fight you, then you win. They're fighting us, and we have had some serious troubles from the wilderness. We've been burglarized physically twice in the last 6 months. We have been subjected to measurable and documented electromagnetic non-lethal weaponry. We have detected levels of gamma radiation in our offices 4 times above normal ambient levels, which is only a spin-off from what's actually a microwave form of harassment, which causes nausea, disorientation, cotton mouth, and irritability. We've had the burglaries, we've had surveillance. I just lost one employee who didn't feel comfortable with the surveillance, but that's okay. We're fighting. And you need to see that people fight. It's not just us. People need to see that it can be done, and that it can be done successfully, because the last thing I want you to do today is to leave here without hope. So we're going to move very quickly through the evidence that I have in the relatively short period of time. The lecture is normally 2.5 hours, and my question and answer sessions around the U.S. and Canada have taken the presentations to averaging more than 4.5 to 5 hours. We're going to run through this. You can see more of this. The whole thing is on the videotape. And as we do this, I encourage you to take notes, and I encourage you to reserve questions in your mind to check the sources that I give you. Now, I want to start by throwing some basic fundamental information at you to help you get a better map of the world. First, I'm going to talk for a moment about the Central Intelligence Agency, because I want you to understand something clear. My whole focus to understand how all of this works is not to follow ideology, it is not to follow dogma, it is not to follow any preset political notions, it is to follow the money. And once you understand how money works, you understand how decisions are made. And money is not a mystical secret to be kept in the 7th veil of the temple, to be known only by the high priests. Money is something that anyone, especially in this age, can understand. So when we talk about CIA, let me just tell you briefly that the Central Intelligence Agency was created in 1947 by the National Security Act. It was written by a man named Clark Clifford. Clark Clifford was a close confidant of President Harry Truman. He was a former Secretary of Defense, very powerful Democratic Party operative for many years. He is also the man who brought a small bank called BCCI onto American shores in 1989, 1990. Clark Clifford, his profession, he was a Wall Street banker and a lawyer. The designs for the CIA were given to Clark Clifford by 2 brothers, John Foster and Allen Dulles, the Dulles brothers, Dull, Duller, and Dullest. Allen Dulles had been the OSS chief in Switzerland during the war. He was a CIA director under John Kennedy, who John Kennedy fired. John Foster and Allen Dulles, John Foster became a Secretary of State, were partners in the Wall Street law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, the most powerful law firm on Wall Street. Excuse me. Many of you will remember during Iran-Contra, Ronald Reagan's CIA director, Bill Casey, the legendary Bill Casey, who was smuggling hundreds of tons of cocaine into the U.S. Bill Casey was an OSS veteran, but most of you don't know that under Richard Nixon, Bill Casey had been the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the primary vehicle for regulating the stock markets in the U.S. Now, under Bill Casey, the CIA had a general counsel by the name of Stanley Sporkin. Stanley Sporkin had been the general counsel to the Securities and Exchange Commission under Richard Nixon. If we move a little bit forward, we have a guy by the name of David Daugherty. David Daugherty is now the Executive Vice President of the New York Stock Exchange for Enforcement. David Daugherty is a retired CIA General Counsel. And coming into the present day, the number 3 man at CIA, the top 3 positions are the Director, DCI is what they call it, the DDI, Deputy Director of Operations, and the Executive Director. That's the number 3 guy at CIA. The current man there is a man by the name of A.B. Buzzy Krongard. A.B. Buzzy Krongard is an investment banker. As a matter of fact, 6 out of the first 7 deputy directors of intelligence came directly to CIA from Wall Street. So I would submit to you, and I think you'd probably go like this when I say the relationship between CIA and Wall Street is much closer than you had ever imagined. Understand that the CIA has been an interest. You take the word agency, it is something that works for or on behalf of somebody else. It works for and on behalf of Wall Street and the big banks and the major oil companies. That's what CIA does. That's one thing I want you to lodge in your mind before we go here. Secondly, drugs. A word about drugs. According to the IMF, according to U.S. Department of Justice, according to Le Monde, according to a lot of good research, the global drug trade generates every year about $600 billion US in liquid cash. Now, I have a great shock for you. $600 billion is too much money to hide under a pillow. It is too much money to place in any one national economy, except for probably the economies of the G8. You have to have an economy large enough to handle that kind of a cash flow. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how powerful that money is. But we have documentation that you'll see in a few moments from the U.S. Senate showing that roughly $500 billion a year in criminal money, most of that drug money, flows through the U.S. banking system and through the stock markets. Bear in mind that for every dollar a bank has on deposit, it can lend 9. Bear in mind, how many people own stock in the room today? Good for you. How many people know what a price-to-earnings ratio is? It's the same all over the planet. A price-to-earnings ratio is very simply, you take the market capitalization of the stock, which is to multiply the total number of shares by the share price. If there are 1 million shares and they're selling at $10, the market cap is $10 million. Very simple. That's the top line of a fraction. The bottom component to the fraction is net profits, which is gross sales less the cost of doing business. The price to earnings reduces to a multiple. In the U.S. stock market, it's anywhere between 25 and 60 to 1. $60 of stock value, $1 of net profit. The short version of what they teach at all the major business schools is that for every dollar that you add to the net profit, if you have a price to earnings of 30, you get $30 in stock value. So $1 of drug money attached to a bottom line net profit can instantly create $30 in paper money. Enron was trading at a price to earnings of 60 to 1. Drug money is one of the most powerful forces in the world economy. Now, I do this all over the States and I'm always embarrassed. How many people here have credit cards? Good. Now, I want to see how you compare to the people up north. There are two items on your statement every month. How many people look at first, well, there's two items. The minimum monthly payment due or the total balance owing. Okay? Now, how many people are more concerned with the minimum monthly payment due? Oh my God, how many people pay your credit cards off in full every month? You guys are sick. Okay. I couldn't function that way. Well, if you consider that Wall Street is basically an investment bubble, that liquidity, that cash is what keeps the investment bubbles going throughout the world economy, especially in a rapidly globalizing economy, liquid cash is the equivalent of the money, the minimum monthly payment required to service all the financial debts in the financial markets. Those who control the drug trade control, it's like two race cars on a track. If one goes 249 miles an hour and one goes 250, the one going 250 will always win the race. And one of the CIA's primary jobs for more than 50 years has to make sure that the drug cash always goes into Wall Street. Every service does it. Every national entity does it. The British do it. The City of London's no different. The Germans do it. The Israelis do it. It happens, but the largest financial engine, I think we'll all agree now, is on Wall Street. So that's another thing I want you to know. And the third thing that I want you to know before we start is oil. I want you to think about oil as I build you the foundation for what happened on September the 11th. Most of you, when I say the word oil, will think of what you put in your vehicle to make it go down the road. All right? Take a look at all the plastic in your lives, in your computers, in your supermarket, the packaged goods, your trash bags, all the plastic. All plastic is made from petroleum. Secondly, if you're in agriculture, there are two things that make 1 acre of land that would normally produce 30 bushels of corn able to produce 135 bushels of corn. That's fertilizers and pesticides. Fertilizers are all derived from natural gas, oil's twin sister. That's where ammonia comes from. And all the pesticides are petroleum-based. The world is nearing the end of the age of oil. And you will see that evidence here today. So when you start to think about, well, gee, we can just convert our cars to run on hydrogen, which is not easy. We can go to hybrids, which just store energy. There is no simple answer because the crisis is here now, and even if you solve the vehicle transportation, how do you solve the plastics problem, and more importantly, the food problem? Now, I want to leave you with those as we start to move through this presentation. Most of you know, and I'll tell you very briefly in case you don't know, I'm former LAPD. I observed CIA dealing drugs with my own eyes in 1977. My family was CIA or intelligence. They were trying to recruit me as a policeman to protect their drug operations. I refused. That cost me my career. I've been outspoken on this issue now for more than 20 years. The publication From the Wilderness is now 4 years old, and that's about all you're going to get on my background, because I want you to understand also that I am not important. I am not important. What is important is the knowledge that you get here today and what you do with it. Look at some of the evidence about CIA drug trafficking. In the mid-1990s, 1996, we had a big controversy about cocaine in South Central Los Angeles. A reporter, Gary Webb, broke some stories about the CIA smuggling cocaine into the U.S. And a number of documents surfaced as a result of investigations of which I was a part. I had a public confrontation with our CIA director, John Deutsch, on world television. Basically made him look like an idiot, and it was probably the most enjoyable moment of my life. One of the documents that surfaced, though, I want you to understand the callousness and the matter-of-fact way in which people do this. That surfaced is at the beginning of the Reagan administration, there was a series of negotiations that took place. Now, in the CIA food chain, the highest rung is a case officer. That's the non-deniable power inside CIA. Below that, there are career contract agents, there are contract agents, there are assets, there are foreign assets, there's a whole ecosystem underneath that. But it's a law in the U.S. that when people in government break the law, somebody has to turn them in, and CIA likes to be very Germanic about its paperwork. So they had a series of negotiations because in 1978-79, U.S. cocaine consumption was roughly 80 metric tons. By 1987, at the end of the Contra War, domestic U.S. cocaine consumption was over 600 metric tons. It's now at about 500 metric tons a year and staying stable. But the CIA knew that there was going to be this huge explosion of cocaine trafficking. Now, they've dealt drugs for all 50 years, but this was a new evolution. Now, Bill Casey, the CIA director, the guy from Wall Street, knew that this money had to move through the U.S. banking system. So first they had a series of negotiations with the U.S. Department of Justice, and they said, well, all right, everyone who's not a case officer at CIA is now, under the law, no longer considered to be an employee. They may work there for 25 years with an ID card, but they're not an employee under the law. Then they said, and it's right here, in light of these provisions and in view of the fine cooperation the Drug Enforcement Administration has received from the CIA, no formal requirement regarding the reporting of narcotics violations has been included in these procedures. That is a black and white letter telling the CIA that it no longer has to report drug trafficking, and the U.S. Department of Justice is no longer interested in hearing about it. Proof of a conspiracy. One of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of direct proof that CIA deals drugs that I have accumulated over a long period of time. This is kind of interesting. There's an Australian angle. In the 80s and 90s, some 28 C-130 Hercules, that's a picture of them there, were moved by the CIA through the U.S. Department of Defense, and actually about 7 of them were moved here through the RAAF in Australia, Vietnam era, that were subsequently smuggled out into the drug trade. And they turned up all over the world, but there were a bunch in the U.S. that were eventually given to private contractors supposedly to fight forest fires in the U.S. A noble cause. They went into private hands to companies that were CIA contractors and proprietaries. Well, the problem is that these C-130s turned up in Panama, Colombia, Peru, Iran, Angola, and they were filled with anything but fire retardant. One of them was captured with $1 billion worth of cocaine on board in 1996 in Mexico City. Now, here's a document from the U.S. Forest Service which facilitated the transfer for CIA, dated December 4th, 1989, and it's a legal document. The lawyers were involved, and just look at the callousness here. Apparently, DOD thinks that by having the Forest Service as the intermediary, DOD is the Department of Defense, if any future aircraft are used in drug smuggling, the Forest Service and not DOD will suffer the adverse publicity. Not what's happening to our kids, but who's going to take the legal blame for it? If you know where to look in government, you can find this stuff. What government banks on is that you won't do anything with it once you have it. One of Alan Dulles' quotations after the Warren Commission report in the John Kennedy assassination was, "The American people don't read." Well, people are starting to read these days. All pigs, raise your hand. You know, pigs versus chickens. Now, coming a little bit forward here, in 1999, the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange, Richard Grasso, hopped on an airplane, and he flew to Bogota, Colombia, got out of the airplane, got in an armor-plated limousine, drove to the highlands that are occupied by the FARC guerrillas who control 1/3 of the country. Now, everybody in Colombia deals drugs. The lefties, the righties, the centers, everybody, that's business in Colombia. The problem was that the FARC were far more successful and they had accumulated lots and lots of that liquid cash stuff that wasn't going anywhere. As a matter of fact, they had this really stupid idea that it might be good to use the cash in Colombia for the benefit of the Colombian people. Wrong. So Richard Grasso hops on a plane and he drives down and meets with the FARC, and what does he ask them to do? He asks them to invest their drug profits in Wall Street. He doesn't say stop dealing drugs, it's bad for our kids. He said, let me show you the opportunities on our financial markets. That's called a cold call. That's the power of drug cash. Now, in the U.S., if I walked into a bank with $10,001 in cash, I don't know how it is down here, but you guys have some pretty tough laws too, I understand. The teller at the bank would have to fill out a currency transaction report, because I might be laundering drug money. I'm a suspicious guy. But under U.S. laws, and I'll bet you have similar laws down here too, I don't even have to look. There are 6 classes of companies that or entities that are exempt. They can handle all the cash they want to. And look at the 4th one down here. A listed entity other than a bank whose common stock or analogous equity interests are listed on the New York Stock Exchange or the ASE, American Stock Exchange, or NASDAQ. If your symbol trades on New York Stock Exchange, you can launder all the drug cash you want to. It's legal. You can move wheelbarrows, suitcases, tanker trucks. As a matter of fact, Philip Morris is being sued by 20 departments or states in Colombia for smuggling Marlboros into Colombia and taking boatloads of drug cash back to put it on their bottom line on Wall Street. Okay, this is how the money works. As a matter of fact, in 2000, now I'm neither Democrat nor Republican, they're both pigs. But in the Clinton administration, there were 6, 7 companies called into the Department of Justice, not because they were laundering drug money, but because they were laundering too much drug money. And look at who they are. Hewlett-Packard, Ford, Sony, GM, Whirlpool, General Electric, and Philip Morris. Who owns, by the way, the national broadcasting company in the U.S., NBC? General Electric. Also about the 4th or 5th largest defense contractor. Now, this was kind of interesting. As we're running up to September the 11th, we found that the Taliban, aside from blowing up the Buddha statues, beating up women, executing people in public, and doing things that were not very nice, did something that was really out of the ordinary. They destroyed, Afghanistan, you know, had been supplying approximately 70% of the world's opium, heroin. The U.S. gets about 60% of it from Colombia, actually. But that 70% of the world's opium, remember, is a component of $600 billion a year in cash, which moves through the banking system. In the year 2000, Afghanistan had produced a crop of roughly 4,000 metric tons, a very large crop, which converts to 10 to 1. So if you have 4,000 tons of opium and you converted it all, you would have 400 tons of heroin. Okay, but the Taliban in January, now the planting season is November, and the harvest is in May, June, in that part of the world. Remember that. Plant November, harvest May, June. In January, they destroyed the entire crop that had been planted. Now, I was in Moscow, Russia, covering an economic conference in March after this, and I was very upset. This I knew was a form of economic warfare against the world banking system. And I did what I usually do. I hang around haunts where the spies go, and you know, people talk and get drunk, and I confirmed that Uzbekistan was awash in a sea of poppies, and that Russian military aircraft were flying loads of opium to labs in Russia under control. But this act took approximately $200 billion in cash out of the world banking system in January of 2001. For those of you who might remember, the U.S. markets were very vulnerable at the time. Okay, what happens if you take that liquid cash out of the market? Form of economic warfare. Now just look at some of the documentation. This is a report from Senator Carl Levin in the U.S., a report that was issued in February, which documented that through correspondent banking relationships, that's banks that can't do business in the U.S., what they do is they pay us a fee to U.S. licensed banks, and then they can move money through the bank, and of course everybody gets their little cut off the way, which is off the top, which is the way it's done. And here he said clearly, and this was conservative report, $500 billion a year moving through the U.S. banking system of criminal money. And that doesn't count what goes into the stock market. And you know, we probably don't have time today to discuss all the ways that drug money is powerful, but consider if you want to do a leverage buyout, how many people have ever financed a car or a house? Okay, well, that's, whew. All right. How many people are aware of what an interest rate does to your monthly payments? Oh good, I like that. Okay, that's better. All right. Bear in mind, in a leveraged buyout or corporate finance on Wall Street, you can go to a major bank, Deutsche Bank, Bankers Trust, Morgan, and you can borrow, and I'm just speaking, I'm pulling a number out of the air for example. You can borrow money at 10% and your payment will be X, but if you borrow that same amount of money at 5%, your payment's much lower, right? Well, you can borrow drug money laundered once in the Cayman Islands. So drug money is an integral component. It is a functional body part of the world economy. They don't want you to know that. Now, Levin said this was a national tragedy, but of course, really what he's acknowledging here is that drug cash is a national asset. It is a vital ingredient. It is something that is sought after and competed for by the intelligence agencies around the world. How powerful is it? Citibank, one of the largest banks in the U.S., in May of 2001, and this is when I said, uh-oh, all bets are off here now. The U.S. economy, the U.S. government had dropped the pretense of being legal. What happened was Citibank, on whose board of directors we find people like John Deutsch, the former CIA director, Robert Rubin, the former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, very powerful bank, bought a bank in Mexico called Banamex, Banco Nacional de Mexico, owned by a guy named Roberto Hernandez. Now the problem is, everybody in Mexico knows Hernandez is probably one of the 2 largest drug dealers in the country. He owns most of the Yucatan Peninsula, and the locals call it the Cocaine Peninsula. A series of stories were broken, I don't know if I have the slide in this presentation or not, no, showing that, you know, there were landing strips, there were labs, there were fuel tanks. It was obvious and egregious, and some papers wrote about it. But Citibank bought Banamex, and Hernandez has sued journalists 3 times and lost all 3 suits. 2 in Mexico and 1 in the U.S. My dear friend Al Giordano, who publishes narconews.com. All 3 suits he lost, meaning there was proof. And yet Citibank puts Hernandez on the board of directors, sitting next to the former CIA director and next to the former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. The power of drug money. Now let's talk about Enron for a moment. It's no different all over the world. You've heard that Enron cooked its books. You've heard that Enron hid profits. Now I've explained the price to earnings. That's what's so important about Enron cooking its books. Hiding expenses, boosting the net profit, because trading at a price to earnings of 60 to 1 for every dollar of net profits, there's $60 in stock value. And of course you all know that the executives at Enron insider traded their own stock and screwed their own employees, right? Wiped out the pension funds. Well, there's 2 general forms of accounting. Enron was using a form of accounting called pro forma, which allows them to be very funny with the money, honey, as opposed to a more conservative method called GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. But look at the U.S. companies that use the same kind of bookkeeping as Enron. General Electric, AOL Time Warner, who owns CNN, Microsoft, Viacom, who owns CBS, Viacom, Disney, who owns ABC, Disney, IBM, Intel, Cisco Systems, Sun Micro, Tribune, that's the Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. And you wonder why they will not tell you the truth about how the system works. They have no vested interest in telling you the truth about how the system works. Now in the U.S., as a run-up, getting ready to set the stage, we have this other little problem here. This is from CBS, September the 10th of last year. The U.S. Defense Department cannot account for $2.5 trillion in cash. Now, you say the defense budget's only $386 billion. How could they lose $2.5 trillion? Well, bear in mind that the Defense Department manages the pensions for 2.5 million military personnel. They manage the pension funds for another 1.25 million civilian personnel. They own real estate. They run businesses. They have all kinds of funds. So they've lost 2.5, 2.3, whatever it was. I mean, a couple $100 billion there, you know. It's gone. Not accounted for. It is stolen. Something is going on. That number is too big to imagine. You move forward. HUD, this is very great. Housing and Urban Development, another source of covert black ops funding, slush funds, not just for black ops, but the world is being looted. This is the point I'm trying to get to. They lost $59 billion in 1 year. And the Inspector General of HUD testified before Congress, and this is the copy of the testimony, and when finally pressured to explain what they did after they realized that $59 billion was gone, you know what she said? We made an adjustment to our checkbook. When was the last time you lost $59 billion? I go crazy when I lose $10. So this is to set a scene for what's going on. Globalization is real. The New World Order is real. It is out of the closet. It is no longer even trying to pretend to be. The only thing that's keeping it from being exposed now is the fact that many people in the world just choose not to believe it. I don't want to hear it. I can't deal with this. It's too big to eat. All right, now. It's making noise. Okay. Let's talk about the oil. And we're going to see more about this in a second, and this is a little bit out of order, but that's fine. The largest untapped oil reserves on the planet are in the Central Asian republics. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, all the stands, okay? Largest untapped oil reserves, and we will talk more in a minute about how important those oil reserves are. But here's just a piece of testimony from a guy by the name of John J. Maresca, who at the time was a vice president of international relations for Unocal, a company which, by the way, has the contract to build 2 major trans-Afghani pipelines that could not be built during the 1990s because the Taliban wouldn't let them be built. But he says in congressional testimony in 1998, he says the only other possible route option is across Afghanistan, which has its own major challenges. We have made it clear that the construction of our proposed pipeline cannot begin until a recognized government is in place that has the confidence of governments, lenders, and our company. Okay, basically he's putting it in very clear terms. He also became a special ambassador to Afghanistan later on. Now, in the context of oil, and I have told you a little bit, and I'm going to tell you briefly more, that during the 1990s, all of the world's major oil companies, or most of them, which includes ExxonMobil, Chevron Texaco, BP Amoco, had invested billions of dollars in cash money acquiring equity rights to oil fields in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. They had a slight problem. They couldn't get the oil and the gas to market. If you go to the north, you had to deal with the Russian mafia and Putin and all kinds of shady deals there. If you went to the west, you were blocked by Iran. There was unrest. You couldn't build it to the east because that's 5,000 or 6,000 miles across China, which is one of the major markets. The only way to get the oil out was south, period. And I have interviewed former attorneys for ExxonMobil and Chevron Texaco, put this in very clear terms. But now let's look at this in the context of oil as a whole. All oil production always has, always will, whether it's one little oil field or the planet as a whole in a closed system, it always follows a bell curve. When you drill your first well, the oil's right near close to the ground, it's under big pressure, it's like the American movies, you get the gusher and everybody's swimming in oil and cheering and counting their money. You start to drill more wells, the pressure diminishes, eventually the oil depletes, it moves down. You have to go into secondary recovery, which means you pump water or other stuff in there to push the oil out, and eventually it takes more energy to produce a barrel of oil than you get by burning it, which is the end of this curve. So it always follows a bell curve. Guess where we are right now at this point in world history? We're at the peak of the bell curve. Oil production will decline, period. Oil is not abiotic. It takes a long time to make. It is not infinite. It's not being manufactured by little people running around inside the earth who give us an infinite supply of oil. The laws of science apply. And we are seeing very clear signs, and I've been writing about this. Now look at, the red line is hydrocarbon production. This was a purple line, but this dark line here is hydrocarbon consumption per capita, and this yellow line is the world population growth, and we have crossed the line for hydrocarbon consumption per capita versus production. World oil supplies are starting to run out. The population is still exploding, and in the world economy as it is now, the way to sustain the world economy is to keep people buying things. And what do people want in expanding economies? They want cars, they want TVs, they want computers. That's oil, that's plastic, it's fertilizers. The population's growing, they need more food. There is an inevitable crisis coming that cannot be postponed or evaded because the powers that be have suppressed all of the major technologies necessary to move us away from oil. And even if we started today at breakneck speed, we could not convert infrastructure fast enough to forestall the crisis. You want to throw 5 million auto workers out of work in the U.S., the people who make and sell cars? Who's going to make their mortgage payments? Who's going to buy their groceries? What's going to happen to the economy when you unemploy them? How do you change the fact that most power plants in the U.S. use natural gas, Siamese twin, to generate electricity? How do you convert those power stations over in time? It's logistically not possible to do it before the crisis starts to hit. Plus you had the major oil companies dumping all their billions of dollars in cash into Central Asia, and they couldn't get the oil to market. Now what will happen is that various countries will peak in their production later than others, and I'm sorry for the graphics here. This is 2000 I believe that's 2001. I have it, it's more clear on my website. But you will see that the OPEC nations in the Middle East peak later than the rest of the oil-producing nations in the world, which will make them more politically powerful. Do you recall that we were told that this is a war that will not end in our lifetime? And where has the war gone? First to Afghanistan, and you're going to be shocked in a moment, Central Asia, and now it's Iraq. And Colombia is on the plate, and guess what, folks? There's oil in Colombia. This is a sequential war to control the last remaining oil reserves on the planet. Because I'll tell you what the US and the British, even with North Sea, have decided. We'll use up all the rest of the world's oil before we use our own. That guarantees political supremacy, last man standing. We have published a story in From the Wilderness, and I encourage you to go to the website. We've broken some very scary stories, which has pissed them off no end. And so every time something happens, like my laptop getting stolen, or we get fried in the office and get a little suntan when we weren't expecting it, you know, we know that we're winning. But we published a story. Now, there's a great American investigative journalist named Seymour Hersh, who's probably the dean of journalists in the U.S. And he wrote a huge story in the New Yorker magazine last summer called The Price of Oil. And he got into the ExxonMobil BP Amoco moves in Kazakhstan, which involved the bribery of the Kazakh president, a guy by the name of Nursultan Nazarbayev. And actually ExxonMobil paid about $500 million in cash that never made it to the Kazakh treasury. And Mobil was so desperate that in 1997 it engaged in an illegal oil swap through Iran. A swap is where they buy some oil in Kazakhstan, they sell it to Iran, and then Iran pumps some oil out that came from someplace else on the other end, and Mobil gets it. Both of which are felonies. They're major serious violations of U.S. law. And there are two sitting federal grand juries in the United States at this moment that have been sitting for some time investigating the bribery and the oil swap. One's in New York, one's in Washington, D.C. And I have proven in a story that I broke here that BP Amoco and ExxonMobil were targets of the investigation and in fact may be indicted at this point under sealed indictments. Now, we've had a little flap in the U.S. over the fact that Vice President Dick Cheney had this secret oil task force all throughout 2001, and he's refusing to let Congress see the documents about who got into his task force and what they talked about. Have you heard about that down here? Okay, it's a big deal, and it's like the elephant in the living room in the U.S. Now, what's interesting about that is that we have shown now that BP Amoco and ExxonMobil got into the Vice President's task force behind closed doors. Now, legally, that's the equivalent of having Manuel Noriega consult in the war on drugs. But the problem is this, our Attorney General, John Ashcroft, and we have a conflict of interest law. Now, Enron, when that broke, because Enron had given Ashcroft money, Ashcroft said, I recuse myself from this investigation, I'll have nothing to do with it. The problem is that ExxonMobil gave more money to Ashcroft than Enron did, and he has not recused. He is meddling with the grand juries, which is an open felony in the U.S. And it's they aren't discussing it. The criminality is totally out of the closet. Now, so there is a cover-up. Now, the problem is that the bribes in Kazakhstan were handled as a result all through the Kazakh government, which has a state oil advisory board which approves all oil transactions and all sales of equity rights. Guess who was sitting on the Kazakh government's oil advisory board all throughout the 1990s? Dick Cheney of Halliburton, our current vice president. Who's that? You know who that is? Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter. You think, well, that's old time. Well, he was also an intelligence advisor to Reagan and Bush. He's a member of the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a protege of David Rockefeller. He founded the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller. And if you want to get very, very angry, I want you to buy this book. It's called The Grand Chessboard. This is, Zbig is one of the most powerful men in the world. He is a man like Soros that you don't hear much about. You know, he's one of the movers and shakers behind the scenes. The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives, written in 1997, 5 years ago. Okay, I want you to look at some quotes from what Zbigniew wrote 5 years ago. Now first he talked about, no, there's nothing wrong with your eyesight. He's an academic, so he likes to do things in different ways so people see it. He wrote this upside down because the map was in the book upside down because he wanted people to appreciate the size of the landmass of Eurasia. And he says the key to world supremacy in the 21st century is control of Eurasia. You're going to see why in a minute. But that's just to show you the significance of the landmass. But he also says the key to control of Eurasia is control of Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. Now just real briefly, look at the geography here. Here's the Central Asian republics, all through here. The largest untapped oil reserves in the planet. Here's Afghanistan right here. They needed one pipeline down here for the oil, to sell the oil to China and Japan, to bring it to the US. They also needed a large natural gas pipeline from Turkmenistan across here to get it to India. And most of you don't know that Enron had a $3 billion investment in a power generating station in Dabhol, India, that was dependent upon getting cheap natural gas. Their investment was so significant that in the summer of 2001, the National Security Council of the United States, that's the oversight body for CIA in the White House, convened a Dabhol working group to save Enron because they couldn't get the gas, because the Taliban was standing in the way of the pipelines. The pipelines had to be built. But Brzezinski 5 years ago said the key to the control of the whole planet basically was centered on whoever controlled this area right here. And you're going to see that in just a second. Let's look at some of the things that he wrote. An examination of quotes. The last decade of the 20th century has witnessed a tectonic shift in world affairs. For the first time ever, a non-Eurasian power has emerged not only as a key arbiter of Eurasian power relations, but also as the world's paramount power. That's the US. The defeat and the collapse of the Soviet Union was the final step in the rapid ascendance of a Western Hemisphere power. The US is the sole and indeed the first truly global power. The attitude, now listen to this very closely, this is in the preface, and he's talking about how necessary it is to control this area. He says, the attitude of the American public toward the external projection of American power has been much more ambivalent. The public supported America's engagement in World War II largely because of the shock effect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. That's page 24 and 25. For America, the chief geopolitical surprise is Eurasia. Now a non-Eurasian power is preeminent in Eurasia, and America's global primacy is directly dependent on how long and how effectively its preponderance on the Eurasian continent is sustained. In that context, how America manages Eurasia, that's the detached realpolitik, don't give me, oh, they would never kill innocent people stuff. This is how they think. How America manages Eurasia is critical. Eurasia is the globe's largest continent and is geopolitically axial. A power that dominates Eurasia would control two of the world's three most advanced and economically productive regions. A mere glance at the map also suggests that control over Eurasia would almost automatically entail Africa's subordination, rendering the Western Hemisphere and Oceania, I guess that's you guys, isn't it, geopolitically peripheral to the world's central continent. About 75% of the world's people live in Eurasia, and most of the world's physical wealth is there as well, both in its enterprises and beneath its soil. Eurasia accounts for 60% of the world's GNP and about 3/4 of the world's known energy resources. Now, there are some parts of this, it's become a tradition in the US and Canada that I have to read with either a German or a British accent just to make the point, okay? This is one that they have me read with a German accent because I was raised on the World War II German movies, you know, so I love that. It is also a fact that America is too democratic at home to be autocratic abroad. This limits the use of America's power, especially its capacity for military intimidation. That's always fun. Never before has a populist democracy attained international supremacy, but the pursuit of power is not a goal that commands popular passion, except in the conditions of a sudden threat or challenge to the public sense of domestic well-being. The economic self-denial, that is defense spending and the human sacrifice, I love human sacrifice, casualties, even among professional soldiers, required in this effort are uncongenial to democratic instincts. Democracy is inimical to imperial mobilization. You want to know, Sieg Heil, yes. You want to know how they think? That's how they think. He wrote it 5 years ago, twice now. The American people have to be attacked and scared. This is one I have to do in British, okay? To put it in a terminology that harkens back to the more brutal age of ancient empires, the three grand imperatives of imperial geostrategy are to prevent collusion and maintain security dependence among the vassals, to keep tributaries pliant and protected, and to keep the barbarians from coming together. That's get out of your Mary Poppins illusions about the way government works. That's the way government works. Uzbekistan nationally has the most vital and most populous of the Central Asian states, represents the major obstacle to any renewed Russian control over the region. Its independence is critical to the survival of the other Central Asian states, and it is the least vulnerable to Russian pressures. He was concerned about either Russia or China controlling the region. Referring to an area he calls the Eurasian Balkans in a 1997 map in which he has circled the exact location of the current conflict. That map was written in 1997, and that's where he says the next war is going to be. Are you surprised? Where are we fighting? Referring to the Eurasian Balkans in a 1997 map in which he has circled the exact location of the current conflict, describing it as the central region of pending conflict for world dominance, Brzezinski writes, "Moreover, they, the Central Asian republics, are of importance from the standpoint of security and historical ambitions to at least three of their most immediate and more powerful neighbors, namely Russia, Turkey, and Iran, with China also signaling an increasing political interest in the region. But the Eurasian Balkans are infinitely more important as a potential economic prize. An enormous concentration of natural gas and oil reserves is located in the region, in addition to important minerals including gold." It's an old saying, God equals gold, oil, and drugs. There's the map again, 5 years old. The world's energy consumption is bound to vastly increase over the next 2 or 3 decades. Estimates by the U.S. Department of Energy anticipate the world demand will rise by more than 50% between 1993 and 2015, with the most significant increase in consumption occurring in the Far East. The momentum of Asia's economic development is already generating massive pressures for the exploration and exploitation of new sources of energy, and the Central Asian region and the Caspian Sea basin are known to contain reserves of natural gas and oil that dwarf those of Kuwait, the Gulf of Mexico, or the North Sea. Once pipelines to the area have been developed, Turkmenistan's truly vast natural gas reserves augur a prosperous future for the country's people. For Pakistan, the primary interest is to benefit eventually from any pipeline construction linking Central Asia with the Arabian Sea. Turkmenistan has been actively exploring the construction of a new pipeline through Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Arabian Sea. It follows that America's primary interest is to help ensure that no single power comes to control this geopolitical space, and that the global community has unhindered financial and economic access to it. That's what the war is about. China's growing economic presence in the region and its political stake in the area's independence are also congruent with America's interests. That puts a premium on maneuver and manipulation maneuver and manipulation, who's being manipulated, in order to prevent the emergence of a hostile coalition that could eventually seek to challenge America's primacy. The most immediate task is to make certain that no state or combination of states gains the capacity to expel the U.S. from Eurasia or even to diminish significantly its decisive arbitration role. In the long run, global politics are bound to become increasingly uncongenial to the concentration of hegemonic power in the hands of a single state. Hence, America is not only the first as well as the only truly global superpower, it is also likely to be the very last. And what does he say is going to happen? One world government, run by corporations. And the last part in German, in the German accent, the end of the book. Moreover, as America becomes an increasingly multicultural society, it may find it more difficult to fashion a consensus on foreign policy issues except in the circumstance of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. Enter the Taliban and Osama bin Laden. This is the centerpiece of the work that I have done. It's called, well, we have a show in the U.S. called I Love Lucy. I hope you've all seen it at some point, okay? And this timeline is called, Oh Lucy, you got a lot of explaining to do. And I have offered $1,000 to anyone, and the offer has stood since November, who can show that any of the sources that I cite are not authentic or that they are inaccurately quoted. So let's go. Now I'm presenting evidence as I would if I were a detective talking to a DA, or if I were a lawyer talking to a grand jury. I present the evidence. These are exhibits. I present them to you, the jury. You may take a piece of evidence, one exhibit. You may say, I totally like it, I don't like it, I partially like it. That's what a jury does. But here's the case. 1991 through 97, major U.S. oil companies, including Exxon Mobil, Texaco, Unocal, BP Amoco, Shell, and Enron, invest billions in cash bribing the heads of state in Central Asia. They have no way to recoup their investment. January 1995, Philippine police investigating a possible attack on the Pope uncover Operation Bojinka, connecting the WTC bomber Ramzi Youssef, and parts of the plan uncovered then and transmitted to the CIA show that they were going to hijack aircraft and crash them into buildings. George Bush says, we had no idea that they would do something like this. December 4th, 1997, representatives of the Taliban are invited guests to the Texas headquarters of Unocal to negotiate their support for a pipeline. The negotiations failed. They had a good barbecue. February 12th, 1998, Unocal Vice President John Maresca later becomes a special ambassador, testifies before the House that until you get rid of the Taliban, we can't build our pipelines. 1998, the CIA ignores direct warnings from a case officer, Robert Baer, about Al-Qaeda cells, and the same information is offered again to Saudi intelligence in August of 2001, and it's refused on behalf of the U.S. Source, the Financial Times, and a book, See No Evil. April 99, Enron, with a $3 billion investment to build the generating station in Dabo, loses access to plentiful liquid natural gas supplies from Qatar. So now their only hope to save the company and their investments is to get the cheap natural gas from Turkmenistan. 1998 and 2000, former President George Herbert Walker Bush, and you know his nickname is Poppy, isn't that beautiful? Travels to Saudi Arabia on behalf of the Carlyle Group. And we were one of the first publications to break the story on the Carlyle Group, which has joint investments with the bin Laden family. And Poppy in 1998 and 2000 meets with not only the Saudi royal family, but with the bin Laden family. Of course, the bin Laden family and the Bush family have joint business interests going back to 1976. I don't have time to talk about that now, but it's there, trust me. January 2001, the Bush administration orders the FBI and intelligence agencies to back off investigations involving the bin Laden family, including two of Osama bin Laden's relatives, Abdullah and Omar, who were living in Falls Church. Greg Palast, one of the greatest journalists in the world for BBC, actually produced the classified W199I report. It's a national security report, held it up on British television, and the FBI agents were going ballistic. These two relatives of bin Laden living in Falls Church. By the way, if you're not familiar with Falls Church, Virginia, it's right outside of D.C. and it's right next to CIA headquarters. I have a cousin living there, and you can spit over the fence into CIA property. Actually, I did more than spit. But the Bush administration tells the FBI, leave these guys alone. Absolutely uncontested. May 2001, I have to back up. February 13th, this is a good one, I love this. UPI terrorism correspondent covering a terrorist trial in New York City against some Al-Qaeda followers. And what is disclosed by the U.S. attorney in court is, gee, the NSA has broken all of Osama bin Laden's secure communications. Here's the evidence. The story is it took 4 to 5 years to plan these attacks. Now, obviously what you do when you know that your secure communications have been compromised, you change them. But even if they were changed in January 2001 or December of 2000, don't you think there was any relevant intercepts? James Woolsey, the former CIA director, when I brought this out, had a minor cow on television. May 2001, Secretary of State Colin Powell gives $43 million in aid to the Taliban. Now, ostensibly it was because all the farmers were dying because, you know, they didn't have their opium crops, they had no money, there was a drought, and blah, blah, blah. The point is, you give the Taliban $43 million, they now have $43 million of their own money to do something else with, don't they? May 2001, Deputy Secretary of State Dick Armitage and George Tenet. Dick Armitage, I could do 2 hours on Dick Armitage, trust me. He's a bad man, he's a killer, Navy SEAL, dealt drugs from Vietnam through Iran-Contra to the present day. He's our Deputy Secretary of State. George Tenet, the CIA director, goes to Pakistan, meets with General Musharraf, and Tenet has a really long meeting. Now, of course, it's logical to assume that the CIA director goes to Pakistan, the Pakistani chief of intelligence would be at the meeting. Now, just hold that in your mind, because that's in May. Because you're going to be surprised in a minute. June 2001, German intelligence, the BND, Bundesnachrichtendienst, say that 3 times real fast, warns the CIA and Israel that Middle Eastern terrorists are planning to hijack commercial aircraft to use as weapons to attack important symbols of American and Israeli culture. You have heard George Bush, Ari Fleischer, and Condoleezza Rice lying. We had no idea that they were going to use airplanes as weapons. This is a direct warning from German intelligence to the CIA. It's reported by Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, one of the best papers in Germany. And their source was the German BND, who was using Echelon, a very sophisticated wiretapping system, and there was a program on that last night on TV. I didn't see it. But this is good information. Now, that's one proof that the Bushes are lying. July 2001, 3 American officials, Tom Simmons, Carl Inderfirth, and Lee Coldren, State Department officials, traveled to Berlin. And they meet with Pakistani intelligence, and Taliban guys show up. And what they say, you give us the pipeline, we will bury you in gold. If you don't, in October, we are going to bury you in a carpet of bombs. They directly announced the pending attacks that were coming from the U.S. in October. Could you call that provocation? You stick a stick in the tiger's cage and you start poking and prodding and everything like that? July 2001, FBI agents in Arizona write the infamous now memorandum about Middle Eastern men taking flight lessons. Here's another great hole in the Bush-Fleischer U.S. government story. We had no idea. We thought these might have been conventional hijackings. When has a conventional hijacker ever taken months and years of flight training? You don't take flight training to hijack an airline, in the traditional sense. It's not necessary. Summer 2001, the National Security Council convenes its Double Working Group, as revealed in a series of emails obtained by the Washington Post and the New York Daily News. Source, the Albion Monitor. Summer 2001, Britain's The Guardian reports the U.S. Department of Defense, Jeffrey Starr, visited Tajikistan, the Guardian's king. What they have discovered is there's massive military training been going on by U.S. Army Special Forces and Rangers all throughout the Central Asian republics, training their military for years and pre-positioning troops in the region. Now, this is a huge hole, and I'm waiting for my chance to stick this up Bush's ear. Summer 2001, Pakistani ISI chief General Mahmoud Ahmad orders an aid to wire transfer, the head of Pakistani intelligence, who by treaty or by agreement must be approved by the CIA. Michelle Chosadowski of the University of Ottawa and I will be holding a press conference on this at the Counter G8 in Alberta, June 28th. It's going to be a pretty big event. The head of Pakistani intelligence wires $100,000 to the so-called lead hijacker. It's confirmed by the FBI to the Times of India. And guess who he had, guess who the Pakistani intelligence chief had actually wire the money? A guy by the name of Ahmad Omar Sheikh. You know who Ahmad Omar Sheikh is? The lead suspect in the murder of Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl, who was investigating the ISI. Summer 2001, Online IE. This is a news agency in Ireland picking up on German news reports that an Iranian man phones U.S. law enforcement to warn of an imminent attack on the World Trade Center in the week of September the 9th. Now, he was in jail and German police wiretapped his calls, calling CIA and FBI, saying there's going to be an attack on the World Trade Center in the week of September 9th. And German police confirmed the communications. George Bush says we had no idea that they were going to use airplanes to attack people. Now we know from overt sources that the Bush administration had been warned of hijacked aircraft being crashed into the World Trade Center in the week of September the 9th. And this is just from overt sources. June 2001, the magazine India Reacts states that India and Iran will facilitate U.S. and Russian plans for limited military action against the Taliban. Everybody knew the war was coming. The fighting will be done by U.S. and Russian troops. Source IndiaReacts.com, June 26th. August 2001, FBI arrests an Islamic militant linked to bin Laden in Boston. This is not Moussaoui. French intelligence sources confirm that the man is a key member of bin Laden's network, and the FBI learns he has been taking flying lessons. At the time of his arrest, the man is in possession of technical information on Boeing aircraft and flight manuals. Source, Reuters. Now we know, World Trade Center, week of September 9th, hijacked aircraft, a guy in Boston with Boeing flight manuals. I have invested more time into this story than pretty much any other. I've written 6 stories I've written 54 stories published since September the 11th. I've written 6 on this particular man. Lieutenant Delmartin Mike Vreeland, a man jailed in Canada since December of 2000. He's an operative with ONI. Very controversial. I have been attacked in the press. We have been burglarized, threatened, and there's an old line from Gilbert and Sullivan that the guilty flee where no one pursueth. And as soon as I went near Vreeland, the attacks started like hungry tigers looking at me as dinner. This man, to make a long story short, and you can read more on the website, having been arrested allegedly on a warrant for credit card fraud, what happened is he came back from Moscow, Russia in December of 2000, supposed to have a meet. He had a pouch of secret documents and had been doing a number of things in Russia. And the meet went south. He was to meet a Canadian CSIS operative and a Russian DFS guy in Montreal, or in Toronto. He shows up to the meet and only the Russian's there, and the Russian says, "Oh, Canada can't make it, you just give me pouch." And he said, You know, there were a number of signals that his scheduled meet had gone south, so he took the bag, switched it for a dummy bag, and opened it. And he found documents that led him to know that September 11th was being planned. This is an evolving story. I don't have all the details yet. But he and his lawyers immediately attempted screaming after he was arrested. He went back. He was ordered to go back and hand over the pouch to the Russian. He substituted a dummy bag. He knew he was being set up, Lee Harvey Oswald style. Turned in the dummy bag. He was pounced on and arrested by a horde of Canadian police officials and locked up on a credit card charge from Michigan. Now, this is a man who's worked undercover for a long time, and he has a long criminal record because that's one of the ways that his cover was established to give him credibility with terrorist groups and mafia guys. The Navy has also lied about his military record. They said he was discharged after 4 months as a seaman recruit in 1986. Yet, when a rush subpoena was issued, the pages of his military record started showing up, numbered page 372 of 1207. How do you get a 1,200-page service record in 4 months? Not only that, his lawyers, in one of the bravest moves I've ever seen in an open court. Now, the primary Pentagon defense computer system was disabled right after the attacks, so they got on a speakerphone in open court, the court report and everything else, called the Pentagon switchboard operator and say, I'd like the listing for Lieutenant Delmer Joseph Michael Edward Vreeland. Well, hold on, it's going to take me a minute to look. We have to go to the backup system. Oh, yes, here he is. His office is over here in E-Wing, blah, blah, blah. Here's his phone number, his extension. Confirmed his rank, confirmed, and it was done in court on open record. Now, we have established clearly that this letter was written, there is no doubt, it is proven, it's in the court record, I've obtained most of the court record, was written August 12th, because nobody would listen to this man and his lawyers for almost 8 months screaming, there's a horrible thing going to happen. He wrote a 35-page letter to the Chief of Naval Operations, which I have not seen yet, it may surface. Very detailed, but the upper half of this was a warning, and his lawyers said, you seal it in his jailhouse property out of his cell. After whatever happens, it's going to happen in 2 weeks, you open it. But we're going to prove to you that this is what we're talking about. You wouldn't listen. And it says up at the top, Navy Pier, Sears Tower, that was an unknown target, World Trade Center, White House, Pentagon, World Bank, Ottawa, water supplies. You know, there's been a recent panic about water supplies in the U.S. Happened just as I got on the plane. Parliament Building, Toronto, Parliament Building, Ottawa, Royal Bank, Toronto. And here it says, let one happen, stop the rest. Now, I have interviewed him and I said, does that mean that the intelligence agencies had achieved complete penetration of all the terrorist cells? And he says, that's exactly what it means. Let one happen, stop the rest. There is so much more to this case, and I know you're going to have many questions about this, but I want to move forward on this. This is evolving. This man's credibility is growing daily, and I have fought huge battles in the American press over this. This man is for real. He's not necessarily a good man. Not all spies are always good men. They have not always hugged teddy bears and planted trees. Those are not the kind of people that are sought out for such a life. Okay, but the fact is that this man knew the attacks were coming, and he said, my God, I have to do something. Judge him on that. If a crazy man runs up to you on the street and says a house is on fire and women and children are trapped inside, and you smell smoke, and you decide not to check because you don't like the man, who's crazy? Summer 2001, Russian intelligence notifies the CIA that 25 terrorist pilots have been specifically training for suicide missions. This is reported in the Russian press, and news stories are translated for FTW by a retired CIA officer. Now, this is an Izvestia story which I've been holding out, and it's on my website now. You can read it, both in Russian and a translation, which shows directly that Russian intelligence warned the White House of 25 suicide pilots. Are we convinced that George Bush is lying now? Okay. Well, it gets better. August 2001, Russian President Vladimir Putin orders Russian intelligence to warn the U.S. government in the strongest possible terms of imminent attacks on airports and government buildings. Source MSNBC, interview with Putin September 15th. I watched it with my own eyes. Now, George Bush is going to tell you now that he ignored or didn't receive a warning from a head of state. And now that we know what the warning contained about 25 suicide pilots, you see how tenuous his position is right now? As I got on the plane to come here, CBS Network News was calling our office asking for copies of the press stories. Now, don't get excited. These are incredibly powerful people. They aren't going to fall like, oh, gee, you caught us in a lie. But the point is, you can score blows. You can fight this. Okay, Bush receives classified intelligence briefings. This is the big revelation in August about hijackings. God, I didn't know they would use suicide. August, September 2001, the Dow Jones Industrial Average drops 900 points in a month. Not too much drug money flowing around to make stock purchases with. Among other things, there were other reasons for that. There's huge derivatives bubbles on the U.S. markets. September 3rd, MSNBC reports that a caller from the Cayman Islands gives warnings of an imminent attack on the U.S. in the week prior to September 11th. Early September 2001, FBI internal documents. This is from Zacharias Moussaoui when they were finally allowed. You know, they were denied the right to search his computer, which now connects him to the hijackings. The FBI was there. September 1 through 10. Now, figure this one out. before the first attack on the World Trade Center, before the first life was taken, some 23,000 British troops were positioned in Oman. That's right across the Gulf of Arabia from Pakistan. The largest British armada since the Falkland Islands War was getting ready to depart Britain for Oman, an exercise called Swift Sword, Operation Swift Sword. At the same time, two U.S. aircraft carrier battle groups just happened to be rendezvousing for rotation off the Pakistani coast. That's not a normal rotation location. Two aircraft carriers happened to be there. In addition, 17,000 U.S. troops joined some 20,000 NATO troops in Egypt, all in the 2 weeks prior to September the 11th. Is that shocking to anybody? September 7th, Florida Governor Jeb Bush revises a new executive order saying that he now has new powers in the event of a terrorist attack. 4 days before. Okay, September 6th and 7th. Now this is what would normally take me a long time. This is a story I'm more proud of than almost any other one. And I have to do this very briefly because time grows short and there's much to tell you. There is massive insider trading on the U.S. stock markets. Basically, there's two kinds of trades that are derivatives trades, which are called puts and calls. And I have to do this very simply because this is hard for me to understand. But a put option is basically a block of 100 shares that you option, which is a set price contract in effect, that a stock price will fall dramatically. The essence of short selling stock is that I don't have to own the stock when I do a short sale. I can do a short sale to this gentleman down here for shares at $100, and he thinks that's a good deal because the stock's going to go up in price. That's what he thinks. I know it's going to go down in price. I don't have to have the stock. So he agrees to buy the stock at $100 a share. The day after we make the contract, the stock price drops to $20 a share. I go out and buy the stock for $20. He has to buy it for $100. And you see, I've made a 500% profit immediately. That's short selling. Put options is leveraged many times over that. Now, there's a debate raging because the secrecy on this, and it shouldn't be there, is just amazing. But put options, according to CBS and others, 285 times normal on United Airlines, American Airlines, some 100, 200 times. We'll see that in a second on Munich Re, Swiss Re, and AXA Re, reinsurance companies, are all placed in the days prior to September 11th. Absolute clear, not placed on any other airlines, any other stocks. The spikes are totally abnormal. There were higher levels placed in a much more active market in the summer, but the way you judge the insider trading is two ways. The ratio of puts to calls. Normally, experienced traders in a flat market will place relatively even numbers of puts and calls in large numbers because it generates paper cash flow for their companies. But the sign for insider trading is a total imbalance between puts to calls. A call option is a bet that the stock price is going to go up. And here we saw incredible discrepancies. In the UAL case alone, it was 4,744 put options as opposed to 396 call options. Now, we don't know how much money was involved. This is truly mysterious. This is ongoing, but you'll see some of the quotes in a second. But I ask you a question. Now, everybody ran out and said Osama bin Laden was making billions on insider trades. Now, here is a man, and arguably September the 11th was Osama bin Laden's life's masterpiece. It was his Sistine Chapel. Now, I have documented over and over again, and many people have, we know that intelligence agencies monitor all stock trades in real time to warn of just such attacks, financial, economic attacks. Do you think Osama bin Laden would have tipped his hand about his attacks, warning of his life's masterpiece in the week prior to doing this? No. The trades were made by people probably in the intelligence services of the U.S., the only people who could be certain that the attacks would succeed. This is one report that came out of Israel, and Israel did not perpetrate the attacks. Israel, I believe, had complete foreknowledge, tried to warn George Bush. That's extremely well documented. And what I think is that Ariel Sharon is blackmailing the bejesus out of Bush, and that's why he can act like an 800-pound gorilla in Palestine. Hey, I know what you did. Now I'm going to go I'm going to do anything I want to in Palestine. And if you don't, and you watch, you see how it's starting to leak in the mainstream press now as the U.S. starts to squeeze Sharon? They actually tried to warn, and I documented one case. The Zim Israeli-American shipping company actually moved out of the World Trade Center a week before the attacks and broke its lease to do it. Okay, this is more reports on the insider trading. Now, here's one of the most telling pieces of damning evidence. In the U.S., it has been standard procedure for more than 25 years for U.S. aircraft fighter airplanes to be scrambled anytime an aircraft under FAA control loses radio contact, alters from course, or fails to squawk, they call it, it's transponder contact at a designated point in time with what they call IFF designations, which is they push a button that identifies the aircraft, and there's codes that tell whether. Anytime that happens, automatically you send up fighters to go fly up and see what's going on. Not shoot them down. That was spun like, oh, we can't send fighters to go shoot down an airplane. You send fighters up to fly around, overlook, wave in the windows, waggle your wings, you know, give a report as to what's going on. And it's happened hundreds of times. Remember Payne Stewart, the world-famous golfer? He hops in a chartered Learjet flying from Florida to Texas in 1999. Massive explosive decompression, everybody dies, the plane's on autopilot, it goes off course. Within less than an hour, certainly less, fighters were scrambled immediately. No presidential order required. One report shows that within like 30 minutes there's an F-16 and an A-10 Warthog flying beside the airplane. But for 50 minutes on September the 11th, with it known that 4 simultaneous hijackings have occurred, 2 aircraft have already attacked the World Trade Center, 2 more planes are hijacked, not a single U.S. fighter aircraft is scrambled from any base to intercept those aircraft. How do you explain that? It could only have happened had the National Command Authority, the President, Vice President, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, ordered the fighters not to scramble, period. And you wonder, well, how would the fighter pilots have gone along with it? Those guys are testosterone, they're patriots, they want to save. Do you remember all the confusion about where Air Force One was? So the way you hide, the way you confuse your people in the command and control structures, you just say, Air Force One may be under threat, don't scramble. We don't know where Air Force One is. And oh, have to protect the president. Intelligence operations are done by confusion. Intelligence agencies run assets without the assets being known that they're run. The CIA could run Al-Qaeda without Al-Qaeda having the slightest clue that it was CIA pulling the strings. Canadian jailers open Vreeland's letter on the 14th and they go, oh shit. And they immediately got a court hearing for October the 7th. There was a date stamp on that. His letter was admitted into court on October the 7th. Now, by the way, the UAL put options were traded through a firm called A.B. Brown Deutsche Bank, a subsidiary of Deutsche Bank, but it was headed until 1998 by the man named of A.B. Buzzy Krongard, the man who is now the executive director of the Central Intelligence Agency. His firm handled the put options on United Airlines. The head of that company, Mayo Shattuck, his good buddy, resigned the day after the attacks. It wasn't reported until September the 15th. The Pakistani newspaper, the Frontier Post, reports on October 10th, since the war has started, this long-forgotten pipeline deal. Oh, it's back on again. In light of recent geopolitical developments, we're going to build a pipeline now. The Ashcroft Justice Department takes over all terrorist prosecutions from the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, the most experienced prosecutorial office in bin Laden cases. Suddenly, Ashcroft is handling them personally. The Dow Jones, as a result of massive looting, infusion of capital from the U.S. Treasury, rebounds. The British paper, The Independent, headlined, "Opium farmers rejoice at the defeat of the Taliban." And SBS TV here had a wonderful thing recently where they talked about a Pakistani general saying, hey, dudes, it's all, it's about the opium. Understand. Of course, the Financial Times now has reported that we are having right now the single largest opium harvest in Afghani history, estimated to be at 4,500 metric tons. all controlled by the CIA, British military, U.S. proprietary operations, all destined to go through the U.S. and Western banking systems when it's sold. Stand by for a huge heroin epidemic this summer as it hits the market. December 25th, 2001, Christmas Day, what a surprise. Newly appointed Afghani Prime Minister Hamid Karzai is a former Unocal employee. Are we shocked? There's gambling going on in this establishment. I'm shocked. That's a line from Casablanca. I love it. Florida drug trafficking explodes in January. Mike Vreeland does his call, confirm his status. That story is going to get bigger. January 2002, Daniel Pearl, who's investigating the ISI, and I know because I've spoken to a good friend, Dr. William Pepper, the lawyer who represented the Martin Luther King family, who also represents the Pakistani government, and Pearl was investigating the ISI, which is why he was killed. In February, all of a sudden, there's the pipeline project agreement is signed between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and we're going to go ahead here to the fact that 12 to 15 world-class microbiologists have suddenly died since September the 11th. By the way, there's much more, but have I made a case to you that the CIA and the Bush administration wanted the attacks to happen, let them happen, and got exactly what they wanted as a result? Yeah, okay. We've lost in the U.S. roughly a third to a half of our Bill of Rights. The 4th, 5th, 6th Amendments, part of the 8th, and part of the 1st Amendments. In Canada, it's the same. God knows what's happened to you here as well. But it's happening around the world. Again, you cannot view this as an American phenomenon. Economically, the world follows globalization being led out of Wall Street. So wherever Wall Street is being led, so there are you also being led. Let's look at some of the fact that a whole bunch of world-class microbiologists have died since September the 11th. We have Amram Eldor, date of death late in September, early October in Israel. A terrorist bomb. His specialty was hematology and viral research in Israel. We had 4 to 5, we don't know how many. Some of you may remember this, a Trans-Sibir airline on its way to Novosibirsk, which is the Russian scientific capital, was accidentally shot down by an errant surface-to-air missile that accidentally launched itself for some unknown reason. But we know that there were 4 or 5 microbiologists there on their way to Novosibirsk. We have Don Wiley. This is great. Don Wiley was a Harvard-trained, world-class microbiologist specializing in DNA sequencing. The guy was at the peak of his form, top of his career, happily married. The official version is that he left a dinner party in Memphis, drove the wrong way from where he was staying on the big bridge over the Mississippi River, stopped his car for no good reason in the middle of the bridge, kind of like your bridge here, there's no place to stop. Supposedly hit a small parking cone, no damage to his car, got out of the car, was standing near the edge, he's 6'3". Now once every 10 years or so he has a seizure after drinking. Nobody said he was drunk. So the official report says that he was standing on the edge of the bridge and had one of the seizures he has every 10 years at the same time that an 18-wheel heavy truck came along, bounced the bridge. So he's having a seizure, he gets bounced, and then a gust of wind picked him up and blew him over the bridge into the Mississippi River. That's the official report. They found his body like 2 weeks later. Vladimir Pasechnik, he was the head of Biopreparat in Russia. He was the head of all Russian germ warfare programs that defected to Britain in the late 80s. In Wiltshire, England, he allegedly died of a stroke, and they tried to hide this. A couple of reporters caught, a little one-paragraph obit here, and they called somebody there. But he had defected, and his specialty was DNA sequencing and biowarfare and new drugs. We have Benito K. in Miami, Florida, cardiac arrest, after a beating. Witnesses said that he was attacked by 4 guys with baseball bats and beaten. The autopsy report says no evidence of foul play. Robert Schwartz, Loudoun County, Virginia, DNA sequencing and working on the Human Genome Project, stabbed and sliced by his deranged daughter and her boyfriends. Looking for drugs or something. Seth Van Nguyen. Now we have a correction here finally. I was relying on published press reports because I had no way to figure out what was going on here in Australia, in Victoria State. But he was a research analyst. He wasn't a microbiologist. I just got a correction before I got on the plane, so I had a chance to correct it. But he did work in the lab, and he was suddenly asphyxiated in a level 4, level 5 super humongous lab because levels, I think, of nitrogen or something else in the atmosphere had squeezed out the oxygen, and he fell over and died. But he was not apparently a microbiologist, but again, somebody could be lying, I don't know. But this lab happened to have specialized and just created a version of smallpox that had been crossed with the mousepox DNA. And that's the lab that this guy was working at, whether he was a microbiologist or not. We have Vladimir Korshunov in Moscow, Russia, massive head injuries, beaten to death on February the 8th, biowarfare or weapons defense program. We don't know much more. Ian Langford, in Britain, Norwich, UK, died of massive head injuries, was found beaten in his apartment. This is a top flight microbiologist. I think he was a tenured professor, and all of a sudden the press report said he was a sexual deviant. Communicable diseases, maybe he was, I don't know. I think George Bush possibly is a sexual deviant. Tanya Holtzmeyer in San Francisco, Mountain View, California, DNA sequencing, genetic manipulation and new drugs, murder-suicide, a guy she had fired. This is a guy who could have gone to work anywhere. He was in the top 10, 20%. He walks up after a pizza order, shoots her, then allegedly drives about 10 blocks away and commits suicide. Many holes in that story, but again, we don't know. Dr. Stephen Mostow, he was a specialist. They called him Dr. Flu, who had done a lot of work on the genetics of the flu virus. In Denver, takes off, he's an experienced flying for 30 years, has a plane crash 2 minutes after reporting engine failure near Colorado. David Wynne Williams, I love this one. This is a guy who is, he's a DNA sequencing specialist, has worked in the Antarctic ecosystem. He goes out for a jog in the British countryside, and there's a traffic accident, only 2 cars on a country road, and the problem is that he's in between the 2 cars that have the traffic accident. And that's exactly the way the press wrote the story in Britain. What's happening? I don't know. We do know that corpses have been exhumed in Great Britain since September the 11th to get the DNA for the Spanish flu, the deadliest disease to ever hit the planet. We do know that we have, 300 million new doses of smallpox vaccine that have been purchased through several companies. They're ready to go. Now, I had a smallpox vaccine when I was a kid. I was told it's good for life. We have this legislation called the Model State Emergency Health Preparedness Act that is slowly being wormed through various state legislatures by the federal government using a carrot and stick funding approach. If you don't fund this, we'll take away your health care programs. That makes it a felony to refuse a vaccination. Makes it a felony to refuse a state-ordered medical procedure in the case of a declared emergency. No habeas corpus, no due process allows a state governor in the case of a declared emergency to seize property, lock you up, take your business, take your bank account, anything with no legal recourse whatsoever. Now, enthusiasm for this is waning. The American people are waking up, and I, for one, am extremely confident that we will have another terrorist attack in the very near future. I think George Bush will need that. And one of the things that I'm doing through my readership, and the people are waking up in the States and I think around the world, is that if there is another terrorist attack, people won't believe it. And that's where we need to be when the next one happens. To be able to say BS, or whatever you call it down here in Australia. What do you call it down here in Australia? Okay. Oh, bullshit. Okay. 300 million smallpox vaccines. Okay, now, to start to wrap this up. God, I have done this so fast, and I thought I had cut it down. Fundamentally, everything that is taking place now is spiritual. Some people don't want to believe there is evil. Some people don't want to believe that when faced with evil, you have a personal responsibility to do or say something about it. I will go back to the argument from Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, the founding fathers, who taught us that God wove freedom into every fiber of creation, that you are bound by the godness within you to fight for that freedom, and that if you don't, well, But in the U.S. for 38 years, we've had a film showing that John F. Kennedy was shot from the front. And when have the American people ever held the government truly accountable? Through Iran-Contra, through Vietnam, through savings and loan, through East Timor, through the genocide of 2 million people in Rwanda, through horrible corporate behavior that's driven by an economy around the world that's like a snake eating its own tail. And by the way, a snake eating its own tail is not nutritious. And it will eventually eat you. It will eat each and every one of us. I am firmly convinced that it is a possibility that the powers that be have decided, in view of the looming oil crisis, that the problem is not that there's too little oil, the problem is there are too many people. Now, I would not be the first to point to scenarios which call for the reduction of the world's population by several billions of people. Now, I don't know what's coming. Fortunately, I do believe in a God. But what I do in my struggle is we have effects. I'm a fighter. I don't just do this to entertain you so you can have nice stuff to go talk about at home. And, you know, I oblige you to do something with what you know. And we are making a difference. We are changing things. But the biggest thing that we have to overcome is a quote from one of my favorite men in the world, Carl Jung, a psychiatrist, who said, the foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. Some people would just simply call it maturity. It is time now to stand up and make a decision. You cannot go home, drink a Foster's, manage your 401k plan. Okay, the way you fight is by writing checks. You vote with your money. You write checks to Len. You write checks to me. Because every penny I get goes, Len and I were talking, we're doing exactly the same thing. Every penny we get goes back into our own business. You know, we expand our ability to reach more people because that's the battle that must be fought. But more than voting with your money, stop giving money to people who lie to you. You must also do the uncomfortable. You must talk to people who don't want to hear. You must reach out to places where you are afraid of suffering. Look, most activists, most people who want to do something would easily take the bullet, but the last thing they want is criticism. Well, you must be willing to experience some criticism. There is too much at stake. The world is too small. And as Ben Franklin said, we must all hang together, or else we shall surely hang separate. Thank you very much.